Hello and welcome back to the studio. Well, as you can probably see from the thumbnail, this week we're tackling those really tricky subjects. Bright luminous bushes, trees and foliage, those things that we love to see in the autumn time, but yet cause us so many troubles when we're trying to paint them. It's an ambitious project and one that, well, I need to try and tackle and do my very best on for you. You'll see, I'm going to be using a range of different things to help me get the right colours for my painting. So, let's get started. So here's my canvas all ready to go, and I've decided I'm going to use this reference photograph for inspiration. Most important, you realise that this doesn't have to be a straitjacket. This is an idea. It's to inspire you, to show you how reflections work with what's happening above. You can see they all look nice and watery down there. But I'm going to use this to inspire me, but not necessarily to force me to do it exactly this way. Now, the first thing I want to always try and drop in when I'm doing these sorts of paintings is a sort of a nice fixed point, which is going to be this water line, where land and reflections meet. Now, this is fairly low down. It's probably not quite a third, but pretty close. So let's pick a nice spot. Now, I want to do a few nice reflections in here, so don't go too tiddly. Push it up a little bit. And it sort of drops at a bit of an angle, doesn't it? See, it starts higher, it finishes slightly lower, and just zigzags across like so. Nice, some nice sort of flats on it as well, so it doesn't all just slope downhill. And what I'm going to do here is I just want to rough in where I think the proportions of these trees will be. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. Now, I'll try and pick a nice midway point. There's that little tree there. So we've got a big chunk of stuff over here on this half and a slightly smaller chunk over on this half. So if we know roughly where our halfway point is, then we know that we've got to sort of try and get these bits in on this side. Size-wise, well, what's that, up to about halfway up my canvas? Not quite on the end there, is it? But give yourself a reasonable size. You don't want to paint these little piddly things. They're just too small. Yes, there are other bits and bobs in the background. I can include them, I can leave them out, I could just have a nice bit of blue sky. So that is as complicated as it has to get. From here, I just want to drop in the suggestion of a few nice reflection shapes. Now, whatever you see above, you want to try and reproduce in the water. So again, you don't have to be too overly accurate with this. You don't have to really work yourself to death to try and do an exact copy. And if you want to paint these really photorealistic, you could trace this all on, but I think I'm going to get a nice painting done without that. Now, I'm going to underpaint this, and for this stage I'm going to use some acrylics, but you could equally use oils. So let's get the palette out and see what we're going to put out for some colour. As I mentioned, I'm going to underpaint this with some acrylics, and I've got a big choice of colours. Different blues and different greens, even some different red colours. And of course, it can get a bit overwhelming, but essentially for this scene, I need a blue for a sky, green for some trees, maybe a little yellow to tint them with. So those are the basic colours I need. I know there's a nice burgundy tree in there as well, but the underpainting colours, well, I don't need to have them bright. I want them actually quite dark and subdued. If I put down too darker or too bright a colour for my underpainting, well, then my highlights won't show up. So let's start by putting out just a little bit of blue for my sky. Now, if you look at my reference photograph, you can see that my sky in this picture is dark grey. It's actually not grey at all. On the day, it was a lovely blue sky. But my printer, if I print that, show it so it looks like blue, then this all turns into mud. So I've had to juggle with my printer a little bit, but trust me, this was a lovely blue sky day. I've got my usual plastic plate, and for brushes, Well, I've got a selection of old bristle brushes, 3/4 inch flat, a nice round and an old filbert brush. Doesn't have to be anything particularly good because I'm just going to scrub this on and just to make a nice wash colour. Let's get started by applying paint, and this is stage 1, blocking in the underpainting. So the first colours on my little plastic plate are some cobalt blue. It's a nice soft blue colour. I put a little bit of grey, which is the same colour as my background sky, in case I want to change anything or make this colour a little different. But as you can see, my colour is rather strong. I want a slightly softer blue colour. I can even take a little grey into it. See how that just tones it down slightly. Adding white makes it just a bright blue. Adding grey will make it slightly duller. And I've just got a little old bristle brush, let's say 3/4 inch. I dipped it into a little drop of water first, just to thin my paint slightly, just to make application a little bit easier. The grey colour here and there. But as I say, I am not going to make a big deal out of this sky. It just is there for my painting. Notice how if I have a cloud going behind a tree, I just paint it right through. You don't want a cloud that stops halfway, you want it to pop out on the other side. One thing you will notice with acrylics is as they dry, they tend to dry a little darker. So I think my horizon line here should be a little brighter. I'm going to go back in with a little more white and some more of this cobalt blue colour here. I just want to lighten this up a tiny little bit more. There we are. I think that's going to be about right. I'll leave that to dry. I'll give my brush a wash. But once again, I'm not going to go mad. I just want a little bit of blue there, and I'll overpaint what I don't want. There. Okay. Tea time. The colour I'm looking to do next is not the bright colours you see here, but the colour that lies beneath. Now, I'll bring up the reference photograph in the corner of the screen here, a little bit larger, and the colour I'm looking for is sort of hidden beneath the foliage. And it's fairly obvious on some of the green trees that you need, well, a nice dark green colour. But then you've got other trees, a bit like this burgundy coloured tree. What would you underpaint that with? It's a bit more fiddly, isn't it? It's not obviously green. It's more of a sort of a black colour. So we'll have to experiment with what we use there. And of course we have our bright fiery tree on the end there. How would you block that in? Again, a tricky colour to look for, but let's have a quick look and see if our colour wheel can help us. Here's my colour wheel, and there's a very useful section on this. And if you turn the colour wheel over, get it facing the right way, if you have a look at your colour wheel, if I'm looking at my greens, here at the bottom you see it says shade. In other words, the colour, that green colour would need that if it were in shade. So this gives you a clue. We're looking for a nice sort of olive dark green colour. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us much help when it comes to burgundies, but you can see when the orangey colours are chosen, we've got this lovely rusty brown colour. So you can see for our fiery sort of tree here, these lovely oranges and reds, we need this sort of brownish tone to underpaint with. Now we've got an idea of the colours we have to underpaint with. Let's mix them up. Now a quick word about that last little comment before the painting police come and break down the doors. I know that shade isn't technically what I meant it to be. There's more of an explanation to it, but I use it as a clue as to how you might pick a colour for the shadow component of this painting. So take it for what it is. It's a clue. For my green blocking in, I'm going to use two colours mainly. This colour, which is called Hooker's Green, so there's a bit of a smudge of paint over the label, and Yellow Ochre. And now these two together make sort of a nice drab olive colour. Nothing too bright. We want a nice mid colour, a bit more shadowy looking. So So those are my two choice colours for the greens. To make a nice orangey brown colour to underpaint this tree, we can use simply hooker's green and some red. I know if I mix them together, it tends to make me a nice sort of brownish colour. I can make them slightly more to the red side as well. And how do I know that? Well, in one of my previous paintings, I made this little colour chart. Can you see how much I use it? Sap green and red, as you see, makes a nice brownish tone. A little bit more red though, and I think I've got the right colour for my underpainting for this tree. Incidentally, sap green with a touch of alizarin crimson produces a lovely sort of warm brown colour. I wonder if I add a little touch more of the alizarin crimson, whether I'd have a colour that's suitable for this burgundy tree. There's a clue. My little personal colour wheel is coming to the fore again. I'm going to start underpainting and blocking in this little tree first of all. If you look at the reference photograph, you can see it's sort of got an olivish sort of tone, or an olive kind of colour. So a little bit of hooker's green, a little touch of yellow ochre. You see we quickly got a nice olive colour. Now, I want this to be a little bit more runny. I'll get a little drop of water, and I literally am just going to block this in nice and rough. Now the edge of this little tree looks fairly solid, so I'm going to make a nice slightly soft edge to it, but again keep this nice and loose. But there's a couple of little trees in the background. There's another one of those little fiery jobs back there. I might put that in separately. Green down just there. This might be a touch bright. I may even add a touch of black to my palette, or even some Payne's Grey to darken this slightly more. I think I'll do that first. There you go. The colour I've just added to my palette is Payne's Grey. I tend to like using this more than I like using black. It adds a nice depth of darkness to my paint without really sort of overpowering things. So this is Payne's Grey. So at first glance it looks very black, but as you see, it has a lovely effect on greens. I call it a bit of a chameleon colour because it tends to sort of just change the shades of things without sort of altering the colours too much. And you can see here that the real depth of colour is right down here in the corner, the big patch of shade in here. I'm going to do the same on this little tree in the background. Now, here's a neat little trick for you. If you want this edge to really pop, to jump off the canvas, put it against a nice dark colour, and then one will make the other appear even brighter. This is the reason why I'm kind of filming this in real time for you as opposed to doing it edited, because you get to see my thinking as I'm going along. You get to see my little happy accidents if I make them, which I do, and you get to see me sort of thinking about the painting I'm doing. There's a nice big hedge along here. I've decided it's going to be a hedge. I'll block that in as well. Again, you want it darker down near the waterline. Now, at this stage of our painting, we have to be a little careful because it's easy to forget what we're trying to do here, and you start ending up looking at all the little details and bits and pieces, and you're, I've got to try and get that little bit of colour, that little tiny bit of colour, that little bit of tiny colour. And what we end up doing is we forget that we're blocking in chunks of our painting, and we start ending up trying to paint it sort of literally every little tiny piece. So I urge a little caution at this stage, not to get caught up too much in it. We're literally just trying to put on the blocks of colour. Oops, a bit too much ochre there. I just want to try and differentiate between these two a little bit. So what we're doing here is we're trying to look for big chunks of colour, not little individual bits and pieces. We're looking for nice big bold chunks of colour, almost like a patchwork quilt, so when you stand back you can kind of see your painting. this little burgundy coloured tree, bright, lovely reddish colour, and you can see there's a lovely dark underpainting under there. For that, I'm simply going to be using some crimson and a little touch of Payne's grey. Now, let me have a look at my palette. Here you see I've got a little touch of crimson, a little touch of the Payne's grey colour. Makes this lovely, rich, sort of purpley burgundy colour. Look at that, isn't that wonderful? That's the colour I'm going to be using under this little tree. It's got a bit of a purplish tone to it. I think that's going to work out really good. If I want, I can mix it up a little bit more to the red side, a little bit more to the burgundy. And say, it's a funny old colour, but we want to just make sure we got it nice and dark, particularly in against that little bush there. I know there's a whole bunch of other little trees and what sits behind there. I'm not sure if I want to put them in. The problem is my painting will become so complicated and hard to paint. There too. Yeah, that purple colour works out really nice, doesn't it? I might actually use a touch of that along the edge here for a waterline instead of using black. I think that's quite a nice colour. So it's just crimson, touch of Payne's grey. Where it hits the green, it goes almost black. One little happy accident I had was I should have left a little bit more blue showing through here in my tree. I forgot to do it. Fortunately, I had to dig around in my paper basket and managed to find the piece of kitchen towel that I used to clean up my palette with. And it's still got a little bit of wet acrylic paint on it. So I just dug it out of my bin and scrub it on my painting. Put a little bit of blue in there. Time for a tea break again, I think, and recover. Okay, let's just finish off blocking in this last tree. And as we look at the colour wheel again, I'm looking at the colour here which is marked shade. So red, orange colours tend to have this sort of nice sort of brownish tone under them. Orange has a sort of light, slightly lighter, and these nice sort of yellowy orange colours almost have an olivey green kind of colour under it. And you can see how those colours start to move around. But the colour wheel, incredibly useful little bit of kit. So anytime you're trying to match the shade colour for one of these, you can generally find it here on your colour wheel. It's a very handy device. You should get yourself one. So we want a sort of a nice brownish tone, and we know that if we mixed a little tiny touch of red and some green together, we get a brown tone. There we go. And we can make it mid brown or reddy brown. So there we go. I've got a nice sort of brownish colour there that sort of matches. Maybe it's a little darker than the colour wheel. Put a little drop of water with it. And again, I'm just going to literally scrub in some of this colour here. Do away with that. There we go. See, I don't really mind what colours I throw around. It's all going to work in the end. I'll finish off this last little piece of my painting. I have to do something with that. Maybe have to put another little bush or tree or something and fill that in. We'll get to that in a second. There you go. I'll leave this to dry completely now. When I come back, we can carry on working with some oils. So this is step one completed, the blocking in stage. And as I mentioned, these are mid-tones. In other words, not the darkest darks or the lightest lights. We still have those two steps to come. I also mentioned that I did all of this in acrylics. It's nice and dry, but if you didn't have acrylic paint or you wanted to do the whole process in oils, you could do. I just suggest leaving a few days between each step, so that way you're not becoming a mud mixer. I know, I've mixed plenty of mud in my time. So let's push on. Step 2, adding some oils. For this, I'll be using a new palette and some different brushes. Now the first step in preparing your painting for oils, especially if you've been using acrylics, is to apply a clear coat. In this case I've got a choice of two. I have some of this, which is Bob Ross Liquid Clear, and if you don't have that you can also use some refined linseed oil. Now, particularly if this is being used over an acrylic, you want to protect the surface of your painting, and you also want to be able to paint straight onto this without it sort of sinking into the paper. And I find that although this has had at least 2 or 3 layers of acrylic paint for the preparation and for the painting itself at this stage, it's still slightly absorbent. It doesn't give you a lot of working time, whereas the liquid clear will actually seal the painting up. It means I can paint straight on top. Now this stage of my painting is sort of a wet on wet. So in other words, I'm going to put the clear on and then I'm going to go straight into oils. You could leave it to dry a little once you've done the first layer of colour, not the liquid clear. That goes on wet and you paint on it wet. But then you could sort of step back from your painting from a day or two and then come back and carry on adding more highlights on top. Hope that's not too confusing. Now, here's my liquid clear. Take a little bit on an old Bob Ross landscape brush, and if you've seen me do this before, you know that the idea here is to apply ever such a thin coat. Ever such a thin coat. And as I mentioned, the idea is to seal the canvas from oils so that they don't have any chance of sticking or gripping to the canvas. And it means that you can add colours, you can wipe them off again, you can repair your painting as many times as you like. So this really is what I call the magic eraser in some respects. Now you'll notice here how thinly I'm scrubbing this on. This isn't a huge painting and I don't need very much, but you do want to run your finger across this and it should feel just oily. And if you're not sure how much to apply, then look at some of my other videos. You'll see that I use a light from usually from my mobile phone, and I shine it across the surface, and my painting wants to be only just shiny. So here you are, my mobile phone. Give it a little shake and the light pops on, and as you can see, my canvas here just got a bit of a slight sheen to it. That's perfect, doesn't leave a trace. But if I go over here, you can see, oh, this looks completely dull. It has no sheen at all. So you can see oil, no oil. And this is what we're looking for, just that little tiny sheen that doesn't have any kind of a trail or a trace left when I run my finger over it. This is what we're looking for. So there we go. My painting has got a thin coat of liquid clear. Now, let's have a look at our palette and our brushes. Do you notice anything about these brushes? Anything obvious? Well, if I told you, they're all worn out. That's right. For this style of painting, and for most of the styles of painting I do, I actually like my brushes to be worn out. Some of these brushes, well, they're donkey's years old. That used to be square. Look at it now, pointy. These ones used to be fan brushes, but I retrimmed them to create this sort of shape, a dagger shape with a little flat side to it. These are perfect for adding little speckles of colour to my painting because I want this to be done in quite good detail. it's only a small painting, so I can spend a lot of time actually detailing a particular bush. Now, these brushes that I've made up, well, you can buy versions of them. In fact, this one here is called a Deerfoot Stippler. It's made by Dale Rowney. As you can see, it's got a very definite sort of shape to it, a little bit like a deer's foot. And of course, now you see the similarity between that and my brushes, which also have that sort of deerfoot shape to them. These are very useful when you want to just use just the point of the brush just to touch in a little bit of highlighting detail. Now, let's have a look at our palette. Do you notice anything particularly about this? Well, you should do, because these are all the same colours I used for the acrylics, with the exception of blue. I've already done the sky, I probably won't touch it again. So titanium white, cadmium yellow, sap green instead of hooker's green, ochre as before, Payne's grey, and some bright red. So my colours are going to match exactly what I've used already. And again, this is an important point to make. If I pick a palette of oil paints, which are totally different to these colours, in other words, I don't use sap green or hooker's green, but I use, say, phthalo green, which is really super bright and super powerful, then it's going to clash horribly with all of my colours. The same with this lovely little sort of, Terry described it as a blueberry tree, with these lovely blues and pinks. Now, if I used, say, a crimson and some black, then I would probably end up with the wrong sort of match of colours for this tree. So my oil paint colours match my acrylics. Let's see how we get on, because the next thing I want to do is to actually go back in here and add in a little bit more shadow. Now, which one of these trees do I start working on first? Well, think about the tree that's actually furthest away in the background, which is actually this one. So by rights, I should really start this one first and then work progressively closer and closer down into the foreground. But that's too easy, isn't it? I actually want to work on this little tree first, because firstly it's green, and the vast majority of trees you're going to paint are green, and it's also a nice big round shape, and I can paint it nice and easily on film for you. So this is the one I'm going to tackle first, but I should be doing that one. Okay, let's have a look at the reference photograph for that little tree. Now, I'll probably bring this up in the corner so you've got a better shot of it. Now, have a look in the background of this little tree. It's composed mainly of sort of that bright limey green, little bit of ochre sort of highlight that you see. But if you look underneath it, you see that there are lots of little parts of it which are actually much darker. Now, we've got a mid-tone green, which is the acrylic, but we don't have enough of these deep shadow colours. So that's what I'm going to do next, is to put in some shadow colours. Let me zoom in a little bit. Now, my favourite brushes for this stage are either a really nicely worn out fan brush with some nice broken up bristles on the edge, or one of my little cut down fan brushes. I'm probably going to be using this next. And the colour I'm going to use, well, we use some sap green and some Payne's grey to underpaint this, so why not use the same again? Sap green, a little touch of Payne's grey, but maybe a little stronger on the Payne's grey. And I definitely want to open the brush up when I'm doing this. I don't want it to be all closed up. I want it to be sort of nice and open. In fact, you can have a little practice on your palette with this. And can you see that you can get those little kind of dits and dots? Those are the sort of areas of colour that I want for my painting, but I don't need to put them everywhere. Just have a careful look at your reference photograph and you can see that there's a nice sort of smattering of them up against this tree. And again, I just want to stab these in. And this will take a few minutes to do, so don't rush it. Take your time and just build up these nice little shadow colours on your painting. And if you've watched any of my other paintings, you know that this is a process that I've used on other paintings before. I actually did a whole video just painting a tree, which was great fun because you really just get to spend time just looking at the subject, looking at your painting, and not having to worry about doing too much else. And here, this is again the same sort of process where you just have to spend time painting just one little subject at a time. You don't have to worry about painting a sky or trying to make it all fit together, which is the beauty of doing this underpainting, is that you already have the whole scene mapped out now. There's a little more shadow at the back here, and I might actually do a little bit more on these edges, because although the painting actually looks really nice and sort of as though it's been sort of snipped around, there are some loose edges here and there, and we do want to put in a few little sticks and twigs and little bits and bobs. So there we go. You see, I've just added some lovely little bits of shadow and shade to my painting. Mainly Payne's grey, little touch of sap green. There's a nice little touch of shadow in there. And right down here on the waterline, you see there's some lovely overhang shadow. If you hear my brush, makes a lovely crunchy sound. That's because it's really very worn out, and instead of being soft, it's actually quite stiff and bristly. Now, you've seen over the last few minutes that I've darkened up this little tree. It didn't take too long to do, but you could spend many hours just doing this to each individual tree. I will do that, but obviously it's going to take an awfully long time. So I'm going to actually highlight this little tree next. But normally I would do this process all over my painting first. I have a second brush that I like to use for adding the next layer of colour. So done the shadow colour. Now for some highlights. Let's have a look at that reference photograph again. And you can see that the colour of this little tree, it's sort of, well, I sort of got a nice little slightly golden colour to the top of it. A little bit of an olivey green colour, as opposed to some of these other trees which are much more vibrant. This bit of hedge here is quite vibrant. When it comes to highlighting this little tree here, see that colours are sort of an olivey green colour. I'll bring the reference photograph up in the corner here. And trying to identify the green tone we're needing to mix. Well, if you watch one of my previous videos, you'll know that I made my own little colour wheel. And you can see here I started with sap green, which is the colour on my palette, and I tried different colours with it, ochre and black, had yellow, Indian yellow, which I don't have on my palette, but I might add titanium white. So I know exactly what colour I should get when I mix these paints together. I want a sort of an olive green colour, maybe a little bit golden, so possibly Indian yellow. I might have to add that to my palette, but I'm going to start out with this colour, an olive green colour, sap green and yellow ochre. I think this will do the majority of my colours, and if I need to, well, I can always add a little touch of Indian yellow or even a touch of white. So, luckily, I keep a second fan brush which I've cut down, and I've got here a little touch of my sap green, a little touch of ochre, and you'll notice when I mix my colours up that I usually put the green on one side and the ochre on the other, then sort of work them together in the middle. So I got a nice little spectrum of colours. And once again, press and open up this brush. You want to really kind of get the brush open right back, nice and stippled, nice and sort of open right back. And think about where the light's coming from that top left-hand side. And again, just touch and add little speckles of highlight. Now, this is again a slow process, so you may think, well, I'll start going a bit quicker, I'll start using more paint, I'll start trying to speed up the process, but I do urge you to do just a little at a time and then to stand back from it, because it's surprising how quickly you will fill this in, and if it's not quite the right colour, then when you stand back, you'll go, ooh, that was a mistake. And then you've got to try and clean this all off. It's better to do like I'm doing here, just add a little. Just get that little shape going. Don't kill all the darks, don't kill off all the mids. Okay, so I've just done that little piece on the top there. I'm going to get up and I'm going to walk away. And I'm standing back now about 6-7 feet behind the camera. I've got my reference photograph in my hand. Well, that's not a million miles away, is it? That looks pretty good. Let's come and sit down again. Back on my high stool. A little bit more paint. There's a little bit of shadow in there that I want to save. Okay, touching a little bit more. All the time loading my brush with little speckles of paint. Now, if you don't have one of these brushes, as I said, you can switch it out and you can use the corner of a fan brush, sap green, yellow ochre, and you just load that up. I just got some on those little hairs on the corner there, and you see it might give you a better effect. See, just change the brush or change the look of your painting. I'll put a little bit more sap green back in there. And once again, you hear my brush making a nice little sort of crunch. I'm using just the very corner of my fan brush. I haven't forgotten, I've got to do a shadow down here as well. So maybe I'll darken my colour a little bit and add just a touch more sap green to that. I think this is almost touching the water, so I've got a darker colour here, a little bit more sap green, and they almost touch, but I want to save a little shadow in there. I think I put some more dark colours in here. Didn't take too long. Now look at the shape of that and look at the shape of this, and you see they're not quite right, are they? I got this, I did this and I realised afterwards it was actually slightly wrong, but it doesn't matter, because I thought when I come to do the oil stage I'll probably reshape this a little anyway. So there we go. And that doesn't really matter too much if it doesn't look exactly the same shape either. Maybe I'll put a little bit of that ochre in the reflections, but keep it under, keep it to the darker side. You don't want to try and make this look the same brightness as that. You want to keep all of this much more muted, and that way your eye will be taken to the top and not so much to the shadow. Okay, I think that's probably that little bush done for the time being. So I'm just going to drop in that little speckle there. Things that are close to the water's edge, they tend to be a little bit more vibrant. I have to give that little consideration here. But things up here, that's around sort of the back, that's sort of curving away from you. So you're not going to see any of those highlights there. They're going to be much more darkened. So that's it. So that's the first little bush done. And I'm going to move across my painting now, and I'm going to start working on these other colours. We'll work on this one next. This little tree is going to be one of the trickiest colours to try and achieve. We're looking for a deep cherry red colour over a sort of burgundy background, and the colour I've got is that red colour, which isn't quite right. It's a little bit on the bright side. It needs to have a little bit more depth of colour. Now, I'm also running out of brushes here a little bit. So, oops, I have even less brushes. Now, I dropped that one I was going to use. I'm going to use this really nasty old fan brush, and I need to deepen the colour a little bit. So I'm going to take bright red and a touch of Payne's grey. Now, you've got to be really careful when you're mixing these colours, because there's a very good chance that this will turn brown. Okay, we're looking for just a small colour shift, slightly more to the burgundy side of things. You see how brown that's gone? Now you can try and get it back, and the obvious thing to try and use is some white, but I warn you, that'll turn pink. So So sometimes you have to use a little tiny drop of yellow to pull it back. But all of these colours are extremely difficult to mix when it comes to reds. They're one of those colours which, well, I think a lot of artists struggle with. So let's give that a try. A quick offer up first of all. I think that's not far off. Again, remember the light's coming from this left hand side, so this is probably going to be slightly brighter on this edge. Let's just drop in a little bit of this colour and see what it looks like. Well, not a million miles away. Remember, we can't add white to it because it'll go pink. We can keep on playing with these red values. And again, think of this as being like little drifts of colour. So you want to paint one little section, save a little shadow, then move on to the next section. And let's say I'm just moving backwards and forwards here through various mixtures of red, going back towards some of that Payne's grey colour, which is a little purpley, a little brown. And I'm just going to play with lots of little variations of colour. Now, if for any reason you have trouble making any colour stick to your painting, it's because the paint's a little too thick and it won't quite get a grip on the canvas, and you can thin it slightly. Now, you could use a little bit of linseed oil to make it a little thinner, or you could even use a drop of the liquid clear just to thin down the colour just a fraction. This colour seems to be sticking pretty good. Again, don't go filling everything in. You want to leave a little bit of that lovely burgundy undercolour coming through here and there. A little burst of colour there at the top. That looks really sweet. I'm just going to go back into some of the slightly darker red tones here. Into that little shadow there. There's some little bits of foliage coming through, but they're really, really shadowy. Remember, there's a funny little bush there that looks like it's really bit of a blend of all sorts of things. I think there's another one of these trees in the background, but so you can get really overly complicated if you're not careful. You've got some fresh colour on the opposite corner, so that's why I don't roll my brush in my hands. I put some of this brighter red colour here with a fraction less Payne's grey in the colour, and because this is close to the water, I want my reflections to be pretty bright. But as soon as I start moving away from that area, I quickly want them to turn dark. So flip my brush around, just drop in a few touches of colour here. There we go. I think that looks pretty good. There's a little bit of a gap right through there. I don't mind that too much. But if you see too many gaps, you can always just paint across them, sort of bridge one little bit of highlight with another, so you break up any edges. But I like the look of that. I'm going to leave that alone. That was a good test run because I'm going to be using some of these colours on this tree as well. So you saw in that last little section how carefully I did the highlighting on this little tree. See, I've had problems painting red trees and red bushes in the past. You only have to go slightly too bright with that colour, or put in a speck too much of black or Payne's grey, well, and you end up with either brown or a really dark, sort of miserable looking colour. Reds are particularly difficult to work with, and I often see people trying to put a lovely fiery red bush into a painting, and it doesn't quite work. So, take a little tip from me. Be very careful when you mix your colours. Now, I'm going to start working along and adding in the rest of my trees. And it's a long process, exactly how I did this. So I'm going to do a little bit of time lapse through the next section. Before I move on to the time lapse section, I stood back and I saw this line and I saw this. I realised that they are very dissimilar. So let's just do a little bit of correction on here before we move along. Again, I'm using my darker colour here. I don't really want this to be too bright down here in the reflection, but let's just do a little bit of suggestion for the highlighting. I mean, my brush is practically dry, so I'm literally going to just let some of this colour spill out across there just to sort of get back in the semblance of a shape. A few little speckles and spots through there. I quite like this little dark V shape here. I think that works quite well. That's it. That's all I wanted to do, just to kind of even that up a little bit, because it looked a little bit out, and it doesn't really matter if there's a bit of this green poking through. As I say, reflections, they tend to be very inaccurate versions of what's happening above. We just need a suggestion and your eyes will work it all out for you. Right, now, let's go on to these trees. Okay, so I'm going to cut in at this point, folks. I like my little fir tree here. It's a little bit neat for my taste. I think trees are much more sort of lumpy and bumpy, and this looks a little bit too angular, like it's been trimmed a little bit. So I'm going to have to, for my own peace of mind, just kind of mess with this a little bit, roughen it up a little bit. But that last little section I put on there, I'm afraid once you see it, you can't unsee it. But I see a slumbering dinosaur or a lizard with these little feet hanging in the water here. So I'm going to have to change this shade because it just bothers me. When I look at the reference picture again, I see that there's actually, looks like a kind of a muddy kind of riverbank here. I'm not quite sure. I have actually walked to the other side of the lake here and walked along here, and I think this is probably supposed to be a grassy bank, but I think the ducks come up here quite a lot, and they've kind of they've ripped all the grass up and turned it into like a mud bank. So let's do a little bit of a mud bank here. So we know we can make brown if we take red, okay, and a little bit of sap green, and I can make a nice brownish colour. And once again, I know I can make brown because I got my little colour chart here. Oops, let me reach across. There you go. Red, sap green. That's what you get, a nice brown colour. So once again, my little colour chart there comes quite good, and it's quite light, a light brown. So I put a little bit of white there, maybe a little touch of yellow ochre. So I can play amongst my colours here. As I say, it looks like a little riverbank. Put a little bit of colour in here and have a little look and see what it looks like. It needs to be a little brighter than that. As I say, it looks it's quite brightly illuminated, so it's quite a nice bright brown colour. Again, just texture this up a little bit. And obviously this is sitting right above the waterline, so this is going to have quite a strong reflection. Yeah, I think that looks a little bit like it's supposed to be. I'm going to try and squeeze that in there now. If this is in the wrong place, I'm going to come down a little bit. If I bump into some of my reflections here, it's no big problem. I can either scrape this off, which is maybe the thing to do, or even use some paint spray and just darken it up a little bit. There we go. Look at the reference picture, you can see looks like there's some very bright, almost white bits on here. I suspect these are probably roots or branches or something happening here. Kind of tricky to work out exactly what you're looking at sometimes. And this is where we can really get tying ourselves in knots trying to paint something. We can't actually really properly identify, we can't actually see what it is that we're looking at. So all we can do is we can just drop in a bit of an impression. That's all we can do. I'm going to have to do some with this here. It's looking a bit too dark. Sorry, a bit too highlighted. So I can darken this up a little bit. Get rid of some of my bright foliage. I'm just going to literally just knock it out. Just using Payne's grey. And I can just literally just dab that out. I don't mind if a little bit of it showing through, that's fine. There we go. That looks like it's quite a good reflection now, doesn't it? And say this is the choice of the, you know, when you're painting away, sometimes you can get yourself into a bit of a pickle. You can end up sort of trying to get too much into your painting, and you can end up really kind of overworking it. I've got to be careful because I'm in that kind of danger zone right now of putting in too much work and making my painting less believable and more messy. So I kind of gonna have to just, I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a little trick. If you want reflections to look like they really do fit, you kind of have to ignore the reference photograph for a minute. Put on put on something that's bright, and then deliberately put it in to the reflection, so you kind of get a little bit of a marker. Okay, so that you can clearly see that that is supposed to be a reflection of that, like this little drop of white or light colour here. Make sure you can see that in the reflection. Okay, so suddenly it's obvious that is a reflection and not just a muddy mess. Okay, and make sure you get some of these little high spots reflected. Okay, and suddenly now that reflection looks much more real, whereas it was getting a little bit muddy before, and it only takes little tiny bits. It doesn't take much of anything really to make this happen. Just make a little dot, a little bit of colour, a little bit of something bright, and then just put it down in the water, and suddenly it's an accurate reflection. I know it's not, you know it's not, but somehow our eyes are fooled. Okay, so that was just a little aside to my painting. Again, little tricks and things you pick up when you do a lot of painting. You learn these little kind of gimmicks and little tricks and things that you can do. Now there's going to be a lovely big red tree here, but let me go back and just mess with this just a little bit more. I just want to do a little bit of work on this nice big fir tree, and you can see there's a little bit of sky poking through. I pushed back in a little bit of the blue colour that I did when I did that, but again, look at the patterning on that. There's lots of chunks of dark and shadow in there that my midtones don't have. So I'm going back to my Payne's grey, touch of sap green colour. It's my shadow green colour. So extremely dark green. You can see there's a nice dark shadow on this side. And suddenly you can start to create a shadow down the side of this lovely fir tree. some thinking behind something that happened just recently. I had an inquiry from somebody, and they asked me about their painting, and they wanted to know how they could improve their work, how they could kind of leapfrog their work, how they could really make a really big stride forwards with their work. What did they have to do to get like a big quantum leap forward in their work? And I had to break the news to them that there are no shortcuts. Okay, there are tricks and there are gimmicks and there are things that you can do. There are all sorts of things, like ways to learn, videos to watch. There is 101 quick and easy shortcuts, but until you learn how to look at a reference photograph, until you train your eyes to do these things, it doesn't matter. Trust me, folks. The best gimmicks in the world, the best tutorials, the best of everything. Go to the best classes, go to the best teachers, and I tell you that until you learn to look at a reference photograph or a picture, and you learn to see what makes this tree a tree, it doesn't matter. There is no shortcut. It took me a long time to understand what I was looking at. I would just see this as a green blob, that is a red blob, that is a bright red blob, and I would just paint those blobs. And when I stood back, I hadn't painted trees. Okay, and I hope this makes a little sense, because I think everybody, I think a lot of people believe that you can leapfrog ahead with a gimmick by just using a special brush. I even made a little video about this where I kind of told people, stop just buying brushes to make your paintings better. You won't do it. There is no such thing as a magic brush. There are good brushes, but there are no magic brushes. There are no brushes that are going to make you a better artist if you can't look at your reference picture and see it a little better than you do. Colours, I've got to be careful here, because there's a little burnt orange colour, ochre. I just picked up this little old brush, and I see a little of this colour in my painting, and I'm going to just, again, I just want to put a little bit of this through my painting. Oops, it's a bit bright. Again, I look at my reference picture and I look at my painting and I decide, could I get away with a different colour? I'm just pushing this tree over a little bit. I need a little bit more free air, free space on the side here. My tree wasn't a bit too compressed, so I just moved it across. You see, again, a little trick there, trying to squeeze it into the shape that I created in the underpainting, and in doing so I would force everything up tight into here, or I could just bump it out a fraction. How do I know to do that? Because I looked at my reference, I looked at my painting, and I realised that I had crushed myself in a little tight. So these, again, I can't emphasise this enough. There are no shortcuts, folks. There are no shortcuts. It's trial and error. It's making mistakes. It is learning to train your eyes to see colour, to see shape and form. I want a little bit of a limey green colour here with a bit of an olive tint to it. So I'm going to go cadmium yellow and yellow ochre. I think that's the sort of colour I'm looking for, slightly more golden. Again, I'm looking at some of these colours in here. They're slightly gold, a little bit of a greenish tint to them, and yellow ochre can give us that sometimes. But you see my painting suddenly starts to come alive. It's got a lot of atmosphere to it. I think that's probably one of the other things that I come across sometimes is perfectionism. I want to paint this perfectly. I want to do a perfect painting. What would you do to make this painting look perfect? And I tell people, really, you know, the minute you start heading down that route, trying to paint perfect paintings, you're in dangerous territory with that. You really are dangerous territory, because you'll drive yourself mad. I'm just looking at this little piece here. I know there's not, that colour tree isn't there, but that colour against the dark, I like that. I like that colour way it comes forwards. Yeah, the minute you start down that slippery slope of perfectionism, boy, that's a tough one. That's when you kind of really experience that disappointment suddenly that, oh well, you know, there is no such thing as being a perfect painting perfectly. There's painting good, and there's disappointment if you try and do more. Now, I'm not going to overwork that, because I'm already got like 4 ranges of colours into there and a little bit of shadow there, which I'm starting to lose. So I can see that maybe I should come back in here and stab back in a little shadow colour. Now, I'm trying to do this quite quickly for the video. If I were doing this for myself, I wouldn't be doing it at this speed. I would probably do some today, some tomorrow, some the day after, some the day after. So I wouldn't try and complete this whole scene in only a couple of 3 hours. I think that's really expecting a lot of the painting to be able to be done that quickly. So relax when you're painting. Don't kind of overwork your work. Okay, I'm going to stop nattering for a minute, and I'm going to start working on this and maybe doing a little bit of work on my reflections. So we're on to this final tree, and this has got to be probably the most challenging tree of all of them. It comprises these red colours, and there's some nice sort of yellowy golden colours underneath, and there's a lot of the dark undercolour showing through as well. And it's a real challenge here, because there's a good chance that we could completely overpaint this, and being such a large part of the painting, a good sort of over a third, this could end up really over dominating our painting. So we have to just take a little care with this, not let it blow itself out of proportion here, and we've got to be a little careful with our colours. So we know that we need to make a nice sort of orangey colour, or to the reddish side. So I've got a little bit more Payne's grey, a little bit more bright red, some cadmium yellow, and I might actually be putting out some Indian yellow as well. It's a slightly transparent colour, and it makes a very nice sort of reddish orange colour when mixed with red. Red and Indian yellow, sort of quite a favourite. In fact, I'll probably put some of that out in just a moment. And I'm going to try doing this with a fan brush just for fun. So a little touch of Payne's grey, a bit more red, but probably something more sort of purplish sort of colour. And once again, I'm going to sort of try and put in a little bit of this dark shadow colour in here. So a few exploratory dabs. It's surprising how bright that is. And again, this is in kind of try and pick out little sort of almost sort of clumps of colour here. Once again, the light coming from over here, so we got bright edges. Don't kill all the lovely shadow. Do a little bit. Then move on somewhere else is the advice. There's another nice little clump here I put in. Now this is the second day of painting. So I did all this in one session. I did this the second day because after you've been sitting with a painting for a few hours, you don't get a bit tired of seeing the same thing over and over and over. So it's always a good idea just to sort of walk away from your painting, sleep on it, come back, fresh pair of eyes, and take another look at it. Be amazed at how different it can look. So I've done like 1, 2, 3 little clumps of foliage here. And so I'm not looking to make this photographic. I'm looking for a nice painting. Something realistic that is believable, but it doesn't have to be so perfect. Okay, grab a little bit of that cad yellow. Cad yellow and bright red actually don't make a particularly nice bright orange colour. It makes sort of a dull yellowish colour. People are always surprised. They always imagine cad yellow, bright red should make something really, really amazingly bright, but it doesn't. It's surprising. Oop. It's Henry Cat going off for a quick look around the garden. I don't think that's too bad. I think it's pretty good. Okay, I may not need that Indian yellow after all. Okay, I think I've got my colours pretty good. I'm going to do a little bit of time lapse and you'll see this painting in a minute when I've completed this section, so you can see really the painting almost completed. When I look at my reference photograph, I can see back in here there's a suggestion of a branch or two. And I think that's probably going to be helpful actually if I put a little branch here and there. Now I'm going to use a little synthetic brush to do this, and I'm going to thin my paint with a little drop of refined linseed oil. Liquid clear is a little bit on the thick sticky side for doing this sort of work, so, and we know that if we use a little touch of sap green, a little touch of red, it gets a really nice sort of dark brownish colour. We can always tint it down with a little bit of Payne's grey. It's sort of almost a deep purple colour, but not black. So it gives us a really nice dark colour there. Perfect for sort of a branch, sort of in the shadows, in the background of my painting here. And I'm just going to hold my brush by it, sort of right down the handle. And I think it just sort of comes across through into here. There. I'll add another couple of little branches. And as I say, I might use a little bit of this in a couple of other spots here, just sort of kind of give it a bit more sort of shape and form. So my tree has a little bit more something holding it together. So you might sort of see the odd little branch here in the shadows. So here's the finished painting. I think you will agree that adding those few branches through that tree really pulled it together. It was a neat touch, if I say so myself. Now, this was an ambitious task. It was a big scene and there was an awful lot of detail for me to try and paint in only a couple of days. So my advice would be to give yourself a bit more time to do this sort of a scene. That having been said, it was great fun. I hope you give it a try. Now don't move because there's some more lovely videos for you to watch coming right along, including the one where I make my own colour wheel. Happy painting, people.